Okay. So welcome everyone. We are very pleased to have you joining us today for this very much needed gathering of, to discuss the financialization of housing with housing experts and housing advocates who are gathered here today for this forum. We are all here because we see the housing crisis continue to deepen on all fronts. And in our work and in our experiences, we see how financialization of housing appears to be at the root of the issues that we face in our work and in our lives. Today's forum is an opportunity to hear from experts in the field and to better understand what is financialization and how it manifests. And also not to be discouraged, but to empower ourselves by learning about the different ways we as advocates can tackle these challenges in our communities and at the broader level by hearing of the work and the success, people who will be here today, to talk about. We are pleased to be starting today's forum with our plenary session. It will then be followed by two of our concurrent breakout sessions, one starting at 1:30 and one starting at 3 p.m. What will happen is once we're ready to start the breakout sessions, you will get a prompt on the Zoom screen that will tell you how to select which session you wish to attend. And then afterwards, we will have some time for Q&A from the audience. So please share any questions in the chat, for the panelists. As a reminder, what the breakout sessions are, at 1:30, we have session 1, which will focus on taxation and financial instruments. And at session 2, we will have a breakout session around evictions and displacement. Then at the 3 p.m. session, we will have session 3, which will focus on decommodification, and session 4, emerging forms of financialization. Please visit the acto.ca website. After this event, we will be sharing the resources that our panelists and speakers share with us, and we'll be putting them there, as well as recordings from today's forum. So if you can't decide which session you want to be in, not to worry, you can go back and watch the session that you were unable to attend. I would like to pass it off to Magda, who will introduce our speakers.
Hi, Jenya. So we have an amazing group of speakers with us. Thanks again for joining us. So first, Leilani Farha, Global Director of The Shift, the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, and the leading character in Push, the film. She co-hosts the podcast Pushback Talks, and has authored several reports and opinion pieces of the financialization of housing. Nemoy Lewis, an assistant professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Toronto Metropolitan University. His research explores how space is racialized by examining the co-production of racialization and financialization in North American urban housing markets. Alejandra Ruiz is a leader with Toronto Acorn and chair of the East Europe chapter. She is also on the National Acorn Canada leadership team. And she is also a housing worker at nonprofit housing provider Fred Victor. Martine August is an assistant professor in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo. Her research focuses on housing, urban redevelopment, financialization, and urban social justice. And our moderator for the panel is Ricardo Tranjan. Ricardo is a political economist and senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And I will turn it over to Ricardo to lead us into our panel session.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just one last sort of introductory remark before we get into it. I just want to clarify that this first part of the program, it's meant to take a kind of overall look at a different aspects of financialization of housing. We will touch on more issues and dynamics that we'll be able to fully develop, fully sort of unpack. It's meant this way. Each of our 4 guests could easily speak on the topic for 2 hours and provide you all the nuances and the details. That's not what we ask of them. We ask them to chat about it, to tell us some of the highlights of the work they do and of the things they have learned. So while we expect that you will learn lots from this plenary, we also expect that you will come out of this with a bunch of questions and inquietudes and That's why we have the afternoon panels, and we also can learn more about the organizations and their work if you look them up, if you look the organizations up. So that said, it's kind of a little bit of expectation setting. Let's get into it. I want to start with a question for all of them, but I'm going to ask Martine to take a first stab at it. Martine, you were one of the first persons to help us to popularize the notion of financialization of housing in Canada. Your work's still one of the go-to to get a first sort of understanding what it is and what it's going on in Canada. But now I wanted to know from you, when did you first come about it? Where did you first encounter this thing that we are now commonly referring to, financialization of housing? And what made you think like, oh, this is something that I need to spend my time on, or a lot of my time on?
Yeah, many years at this point. Thanks, Ricardo, for the introduction, and thanks to the organizers, and welcome everybody. I'm just seeing there's so many people on the participant list, so hi, everybody. So I first got into this topic back in 2014. At that time, I was living in Parkdale, a neighborhood in Toronto that I think many people are probably familiar with. And there was this company called Achilles, based in Sweden, that was buying up apartment buildings in Parkdale. So my reaction to what I saw happening was surprise, because what I had kind of been learning in school about gentrification was that it was not possible to gentrify entire apartment buildings. But here was this company that was buying entire apartment buildings, pushing people out, renovating vacant suites, raising the rents up, and just massively threatening the affordability of apartments in Parkdale. And in Parkdale, apartments are a really important source of affordable housing. So to me, it just looked like there was this new thing going on that was catalyzing gentrification on a vast new scale. So I was interested at that time in how tenants in Parkdale were coming together to organize against this company and fight back against the rent increases and the displacement. And as I learned more about it, I increasingly was also becoming really interested in the companies that were doing this. And Achilles was just the tip of the iceberg. And in fact, they're kind of unique in being a foreign firm when most of the companies involved in this in Canada are actually domestic companies. So I began to document the growth of financial firms in the rental housing world in Canada. And this includes companies like real estate investment trusts or REITs, publicly listed real estate companies, private equity funds, asset management companies, also institutional investors like pension funds and insurance companies. And what I found was that these types of financial firms are increasingly consolidating ownership of apartment buildings in Canada, and that this is part of a trend called financialization. So to give some background on what that means, financialization is defined as the growing dominance of finance in the operations of global capitalism. And it's a shift that's been underway in the economy over the past few decades, in which we see that money is increasingly being made through financial channels rather than through productive channels. So making money by investing, borrowing, and lending, rather than making money by making things. And so researchers have looked a lot at the way that financialization is changing the world of housing. We all remember the subprime mortgage crisis, which is tied to the financialization of mortgages. And this is where, rather than just lending money to people to buy a house, we saw mortgages getting turned into securities, and that those mortgages were being sold as products for investors. And this was leading to the issuance of increasingly risky mortgages, driving up home prices, increasing volatility, until we saw in the US crisis hit in 2007, 2008, and we all remember what happened after that. When it comes to apartments, it's a little different from mortgages. Financial firms are taking these apartments and turning them into a product for investors. So they're making apartments something that's easy to invest in and make returns from. So how it works is financial operators like real estate investment trust or a private equity fund, they get capital from investors, they buy a whole bunch of buildings, and then the investors get a share of the rental income that's being collected every month. An important thing to note about financial firms is that they're operating on very particular logics, and they're highly motivated to increase their profits so that they can keep these investors coming back. So if their share price starts to dip, or if investors aren't getting the returns that they expect, they might flee. And so in order to keep their investors, financial firms are very compelled by their own structure to aggressively chase higher profits. In apartments, they do this in a few ways. They try to drive down their costs by saving more money. they also try to raise up their revenues. And they do this largely by charging people more fees and more rents. So what we've been seeing is that these firms are systematically applying for rent increases, guideline rent increases in Ontario, also above guideline rent increases or AGIs. And then most lucratively for them, we see them just jacking up rents on vacant units, sometimes by 100%, 200%, even 400%. So I guess to kind of summarize my answer to your question is that I decided to pay attention to this new trend because it seemed like something very important that was affecting housing security and affordability in the city. And that it was sort of gaining a lot of steam without people quite noticing, but seemed important. And so I think it's important to question whether or not financial firms should be allowed to buy up housing and make it unaffordable like this, gentrifying neighborhoods beyond all recognition and limiting the places in the city that people have to live.
Thank you, Martine. Thank you for that great 101. And thank you for jumping on that. We're all glad you did when you did. And about the same time that you were sort of starting to look into this, Leilani was out there, mostly in the international and domestic scene, kind of like sounding the alarms about this. And so Leilani, tell us a little bit more. What made you focus on that and say, folks, listen, this is something we ought to pay attention. We ought to pay attention now. We're not 10 years from now. What made you be so passionate about it and so early in comparison to where kind of popular knowledge was at that time?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for inviting me to this conversation. And it's so nice to see so many friendly names. Don't see everyone's faces, but all roads apparently lead to 2014. That's where Martine started, and it's kind of where I started. So I was appointed UN rapporteur in that year, and quite quickly I came across a figure, and it was something like 163 trillion US dollars. And that was the figure I had read as the global value of residential real estate. And I was like, $163 trillion? Like, what is that? That's like a whole heck of a lot of money. I couldn't even get my head around it. I mean, it's, like more than the world's GDPs a couple times over. So I was like, whoa, what's going on? And my UN assistant said to me, you know what would make a great report? Let's follow the money. So I was like, all right, let's follow the money. So we started following the money. And what we noticed as we were following the money was that what we were seeing on the ground in every region of the world, in every city I was visiting, was that while there was this global value, this incredible value of residential real estate, people were living in the worst conditions. Homelessness in every city, unaffordability in every city, lack of security of tenure in every city, deplorable housing conditions and rental accommodation and informal settlements, et cetera. So it was the gap between people's experiences and then this value that really intrigued me. How could it be, right? And so I actually heard of a conference that was happening out in Vancouver, bringing together some of the people who were really interested in this phenomenon, the financialization of housing, as expertly detailed just now by Martine. So I went to that conference, and what I noticed was that while there were sociologists, urban geographers, political economists talking about this phenomenon, what they weren't doing was because they're not human rights lawyers, they weren't examining it from the perspective of human rights. And so that became my inquiry. So this phenomenon is going on. Like, should I care? Does this have human rights implications? And I soon learned that, of course, it has human rights implications. And it in particular, I've sort of honed in on three. There are of course more, but obviously the phenomenon of financialization of housing drives up rental costs and the cost of housing. And Martine has already explained that. So that's leading to the unaffordability crisis that we're seeing in every city in the world. And then on top of that, we see it threatens security of tenure. people are living in fear that their rents are going to go up and they might have to move out, or they'll fall into arrears, or they are falling into arrears as, for example, above guideline rent increases are granted. And then on top of that, there are habitability issues where landlords are creating really hostile environments where people are living, or they're demolishing places and not ensuring people can get back to their homes, et cetera. And so there were those three like obvious ways in which the right to housing was being jeopardized, my work discovered. But there was one other that I just want to put out there, which is that these actors often have incredible political access and persuasion. And as a result, they sit at tables that define policy and define legislation. Bill 23 is a perfect example. That's Bill 23 is a developer's bill, now legislation, or soon to be. And they undermine the right to housing through their access to governments. And this is, of course, in Canada, but I've seen it in the United States. I'm seeing it in Europe, across the European Union as well. So, anyway, that's how I got involved. And then, as luck would have it, a documentary filmmaker, Frederick Gerton, found me and wanted to make a film about the issue. And people think I made the film. I had nothing to do with the film. Frederick made the film, and that's helped, I hope, to popularize the issue.
And that's a great film. And for better or for worse, it's still very current and very relevant. What's the name of the film, Leilani, if others want to look it up?
The film is called Push, and actually you can watch it for free on TVO, but please watch the feature-length version, 92 minutes, not the shorter version. Thanks.
Thank you. Nemoy, I wanted to go over to you now. What I personally have learned and from your work, and what kind of, takes me to your work, it's a little bit of the comparative aspect of these processes. I think that what I see you doing, at least for me, when I'm trying to learn about this, you start to drawing some of the patterns and start naming some of the systemic outcomes that we see through it, learning from the United States and how it applies to Canada. And so making our understanding a little bit more wholesome. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you got into that?
So I got started back, I'm going to date myself. I got started back in 2007 when I was a third-year undergraduate student in the geography department at U of T. And I got started largely because of the subprime mortgage crisis. And I was very much interested in understanding how subprime mortgages and foreclosures were impacting the African-American community. And part of the reason why I got started with it was at the time of the crisis, there was a lot of emphasis that was on the failures of banks, the failures of institutions, but missing from the discourse was an understanding of how people were actually experiencing foreclosures. What were some of the sacrifices that people were undertaking in order to stay housed or remain housed? And through that work, I continued it to pursue a PhD in examining and doing a comparative study between Chicago, Illinois, and Jacksonville, Florida, to better understand the Black homeowners' experience with respect to foreclosures. But also, I wanted to sort of provide this sort of counter narrative. That these were greedy borrowers that borrowed more than they could afford, but rather that these were victims of an underlying discriminatory financial system that preyed upon the historical disadvantage of having access to home ownership. And through that work, I began to notice while folks were being removed from their homes, their homes were being foreclosed upon, and folks were being evicted. One of the things that I noticed was there was a lot of corporate entities that were then acquiring these single family homes for the sole purposes of turning them into rental properties in order to generate income. And as Martine alluded to with respect to how they were doing this was through a particular instrument that the folks at Blackstone Group, one of the world's largest private equity firm, created, was a financial instrument called rent-backed securities, which works very similar to mortgage-backed securities, with the only exception is that your rental payments are being used to pay bondholders and shareholders that acquire these particular securities. So back in about 2016, 17, one of my mentors encouraged me to actually pursue research in Canada and stop doing research in the US, and that I should think about how these particular practices are taking shape and unfolding in communities across Canada. So I started to explore this issue a little bit even further when the Wellesley Institute released a study back, I believe, in 2020, in where they talked about that Black renters had a higher likelihood of experiencing evictions in the city, though the story sort of ends right there. And so we sort of don't really know who's responsible for these particular practices that were exacerbating the affordability and displacement problems in Black communities. In one particular community, a community that I grew up in, which was the Little Jamaica community on Eglinton West, started to experience a huge flux of financialized landlords. And this particular community is located in the former borough of City of York, and where financialized landlords now account for 63% of the market share of units under the control of financialized landlords. And so I wanted to understand, how did that happen? And so one of the things that really pointed me to this direction was the Eglinton LRT crosstown, and where I started to recognize how infrastructure investment was being used as an anchor to attract investors of the likes of financialized landlords and developers who would otherwise not have considered this community as valuable. And as such, at the start of the millennium, financialized landlords only accounted for 10% of the market share. By the time of announcement, that market share increased to, I think, just in 2007, when the announcement came down, that market share increased to, I believe, just under 20%. And then in 2011, when construction started, it jumped to about just under 40%. And today it's about 63%, with one particular company, Starlight Investment, being the largest owners of multifamily units. And as such, I wanted to understand more about their behaviors, understand who is actually financing these particular financial intermediaries, such as private equity firms, asset management firms. And through that, I began to focus my attention on pension funds, who are one of the largest investors to these particular entities. So as such, I wanted to then even expand that even further to understand even those who are providing loans to these particular companies, and expanding that research to attribute some of the bridge financing from banks such as CIBC, Toronto Dominion Bank, and Computershare Trust Company, and how those investments are contributed to exacerbating the affordability and displacement problems in various communities across the city, especially within Black communities with over a 30% population.
Thank you. That was great. That was great. And that started getting us into the next question and some of the dynamics and the broader, as I mentioned in the opening, you always made me go there, like think about the bigger comparative and the big picture political economy of it all. But I want to talk to Alejandra now. Alejandra, like Martine in her opening comments, she mentioning that by the time she started looking at this, there was some already organizing on the ground going on. So it's not for people organizing, for organizers, for social movements. It's not something that they learn from from the research, and then they sort of decided to go out there and do something about it. It's never happens quite like this, right? You guys were already doing it. So tell me about a little bit that initial moment of organizing, of understanding that, or realizing that, we are against something new here. How did you and your organization, Acorn, come to face that?
Yes, thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, everybody. So, unfortunately, my heater is on. I don't know if you hear. I was praying, please don't work, and precisely. Anyway, so very happy to be here. And yes, Acorn started in 2004 here in the city of Toronto. And we start to knock at doors, and we start to see the state of these repairs, especially in Jane and Finch, in the chapter at Jane and Finch. And people complaining, oh, the landlord don't even reply to us. The landlord don't even do repairs. We had to pay our rent every month, of course, but they don't do repairs. We don't know what to do. And this is when we started to organize and to do actions and to call the landlord, write letters, call Ministry of Housing, and start to put the issue that probably was beyond, but it wasn't really look at it at that point. And this is when we start to notice how come these massive buildings, tall buildings in Jane and Finch, they have not been repaired. What is the issue? So they start, because by the way, we have been since 2004 fighting for landlord licensing, fighting for loopholes in the Rent Tenancy Act, fighting for what Leilani described now, the Bill 23, meaning the attachment of the inclusionary zoning that has been dealt with since 2005. But then we realized why this happened. And so we realized that the government here, specifically in Ontario, has given a lot of power to landlords. We are very unprotected as a tenants. And in total, all the skyrocketing rents, we had many loopholes in the Rent Tenancy Act, like for example, what Martine and Leilani was referring about the guideline increases. This has been an open door for landlords to ostracize tenants, to make our lives miserable. And by the way, I don't know if you know, but many tenants and members of Acorn, we had a PhD. We had a PhD in suffering. We had a PhD in frustration. We had a PhD in desperation, you know. So this I try to make it fun, something fun, because sometimes we need to laugh about the adversity. Anyway, so for us, it's been very difficult to navigate this, but as Ricardo was starting, we need to give hope, isn't it? We need to know that together we can do changes. And how is that we're going to do that is organizing. So I don't want to touch too much in that right now, but the other piece that is important is the vacancy control. Again, the government has given a door to landlords to increase rent. And let's say when Leilani moved from her home and then Martine tried to take this home, the rent is going to be increased. Like this is like the Wild West. There's no regulations that protect tenants. There's no regulation to help us to move forward. And people, as Leilani was saying, we live in fear. The other day, I had to say something in Queen's Park, and we were saying, okay, Ukraine has war, Syria has bombs, but we here in Toronto and Canada, we have paper bombs, you know. Every time we see a paper under our door, we are scared, we are petrified. What about if this is about the guideline increase? What about if this is more increase, or they're going to demolish the building, or they're going to say that a family member is coming that we had to move out? So this is something that is like a monster in this in our society. It's something that is eating us alive, and we really don't have too much support because the government is still passing bills. Bill 23 is still giving sweet deals to the developers, sorry, to the landlords. So this is why these places where we can speak and planify and really knows the issue are really great. So I think so. I will leave it to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Alejandra. It was a great segue. I'm going to come back right to you because I have a follow-up question. But to introduce that question, I want us to take a little step back and think a little bit about this and a little bit in historical terms, right? In many places around the world, land is at some point stolen. And the people who live in that land, they are murdered, or they are turned into enslaved people, or they're forced into wage labor, so that land can become private property. And once it becomes private property, we start trading, we build house on it, that is also private property, and now housing, land, and the people, if they survive the genocide, they become just part of that market, and they're traded, there's a price tag on it, and they can be sold and bought for profit. Not in any way to belittle the ongoing impact, the ongoing effects that both genocide, colonization, and any sort of brutal process of depossession has on and continues to have. And we know, for one, that Canada hasn't even begun to address this seriously. The fact is that now for a long time in Canada, land and housing has been treated as commodities, and landlords have profited from it. And the private market has allocated housing according to its own logic. And the Canadian governments in general have heavily relied on the private sector to deliver housing. So in that context, what's so different about financialized housing? How that changed that historical pattern of expropriation, repossession, and profit making? So to be more specific, Alejandra, when you guys are organizing against an IGI, against a above guideline increase, how does it matter, if it matters, that you are against a large real estate investment company or a small landlord acting on bad faith?
Well, what we have found is that it matters that they are big landlords for the fact that they have a lot of money. So this means that they had all the lawyers in the world to spend all days looking to change the law, or looking to change to, of course, win the case. And we sometimes, if we had a lawyer, they can go and meaning a legal aid lawyer. Well, this lawyer has tons of cases and doesn't have really the ability to spend so many times. I don't say that the lawyer has no win cases. Yes, we have win cases, but you know, the difference is like a giant with a, like Goliath and David. I don't know, you know the story, people here, but it's a giant, a little person who no has really power, but it has the heart to do the changes, let's say. But anyway, the thing with these landlords is that they had the money, and they had the lawyers. The other thing that right now, specifically right now, is affecting low income and moderate income with the lawyers, with the support, is that these organizations right now are so overwhelmed with cases that they are needed, they are in the need to say, well, I cannot do your case because I don't know what are their legalities or their case loads, but probably it's because they are overwhelmed. So, and then we have the other people that is no middle class, but doesn't make enough money or less more, doesn't make the income threshold is not enough to have a lawyer.
So
And
what you're telling us, Alejandra, if I'm so sure.
Sure.
So you're telling us that in that wild old west, some
Yes.
have more ammunition than others, and you're telling me that they bring that economic power to in often in the form of offices stacked with lawyers to the table, as opposed to some smaller landlords that are less likely to be able to do that.
Yes, we have revolvers and they have, gun machines and missiles.
Okay.
Put it like that way.
Thank
Yes,
you.
yeah.
Nemoy, you also studied the transformation, and as you said, one of the things that called your attention to this topic in the first place was how the people were directly affected, not just the big picture trends and economic patterns, but how people were experiencing that crisis differently. And so how do you see it being different, this sort of new wave of types of landlords?
Well, I don't see it as any different, but rather like one of the things that I try to do within my own work is to try to position financialization and as a part of a longer legacy of discrimination that some of the most economically oppressed people have faced. And one of the things is that, we should, understand in how extraction and how dispossession mortgages were used during colonial times as ways to extract land from Indigenous people. And so one of the things that I try to do is to position how mortgages work very similar in terms of rental payments, and how we see how these particular entities use higher rents as a way to dispossess some of the most vulnerable segments of our population of their housing, and how they exacerbate rents within these particular communities through AGIs, as Martine alluded to, and some of the other folks on the panel. And that's one of the ways that, these folks, tend to, use these particular instruments in order to dispossess folks of their housing. I did want to point out that, over the last 12 years, from 2010 to 2022, financialized landlords have accounted for nearly 50% of all AGI applications in this city. One particular entity, Starlight Investment, accounted for 203 applications for AGIs. So while folks like to make the argument that these folks are making improvements to the properties in order to improve the quality of living in these particular units, I would push back and say that they're not doing it for free. They're not doing it out of the kindness of their heart. They're doing it for the sole purposes, as Martine and some of the others have talked about, in order to maximize their returns on their investment, and in order to attract higher income households and more affluent renters to these particular properties, but also to frustrate some renters who are protected under rent control and remove them and try to pressure them to leave due to the price pressures of the higher rents that some of these folks have to pay.
Thank you. Leilani, how is it different for you, or not different? As Nemoy said, is it a continuation? Is this, 2.0, or is it completely new? What's your take?
Yeah, my take, I think, is similar to the previous speakers. What I would say is that the financial actors that are engaged in the housing sector right now are different in kind to what we've seen previously. So different than, a family trying to buy a home, or different than even a small corp. These are actors with unprecedented amounts of capital and unprecedented access to cheap capital, money. And that, to me, differentiates them. But their methods are exactly as Nemoy described. They are of the colonial era, without a question or without doubt. I mean, whether it's their intention or not, the impact of what they're doing is to displace people, the most disadvantaged groups, from their homes and lands. That's what's happening. And so in that way, we see a complete replication, duplication. And let's not forget who the actors are. I mean, most of the folks heading these companies are white men. And like, I'm just going to name it, you know, it's like wherever we go, that's who we're finding. And they do have unprecedented power and resources. And so in that way, I do want to sort of differentiate, although I suppose if you think back, I suppose the colonizers had unprecedented for their times resources. The other thing I want to say that I think doesn't get talked about enough is how global capital actually is. So we can talk about Canadian pension funds investing in housing in Canada, or, you know, multifamily, et cetera. But those pension funds are also very active in Western Europe and in the United States. We can talk about a company like Acalius acting here. They're Swedish, so-called Swedish. I mean, their headquarters are in the Bahamas or something like that. But, you know, these are global actors. It's for that reason, I guess, that I have felt quite strongly that we need a global response. Not that we don't need homegrown local responses. Of course we do. And, you know, the movement and energy that's starting here in Canada, thanks a lot to Acorn and Martine's work and others, Nemoy and Jackie Brown, and I mean, there's others, you know, that's super important. But I also feel a global response is necessary, and responses at the global level, like through our multilateral institutions like the United Nations. I think we have to start, I've been trying to do this through my own work, start going to those places and spaces where there are international convenings of these international investors. The REITs participate in these, the Canadian REITs participate in these international events. There's 43 countries in the world with REITs, and they form their own kind of global network. And so that's I feel that we need to constantly be operating at both levels, that domestic level and at that international global level.
Thank you. Martine, I will ask you to add anything to this conversation of new, not new, but also if you can share with us a little bit about your work on the application of this, what Leilani called these methods, into other spheres of public or social goods.
Sure. So I'll just kind of agree with what others have said, that you see financialization is continuing some of the trends that you mentioned, Ricardo, in your opening question, in that it's accumulating capital by dispossession. You discussed stolen land. We're seeing that money is being made here by displacing people, dispossessing them of greater shares of their income. And this is part of a bigger transfer of wealth that we've been seeing as part of financialization in the global economy, a transfer of wealth from people who have less, lower income people, to those who have more, like the 1%. And this is happening unequally. Firms are capitalizing on social difference. In the same way we've heard of this term racial capitalism that's been happening for a long time, as Nemoy has pointed out. So in terms of differences between small companies and REITs, I agree that it's an intensification in a way. So on the one hand, we have this landlord and tenant relation. It's always been unequal. It's always been built on exploitation. And whether that's a mom and pop or whether it's a REIT. So I think it's important to not take critiques of financialization to seem like there's support for a smaller scale landlords. I don't think that they're morally superior or a better form. But on the other hand, I think it's also the case, as Leilani pointed out, that these financial firms do have a different impact, and we can measure that. They're structurally motivated to maximize their profits in a new way, and we do see some differences in their behavior. So I've seen in some research with Julie Ma at the University of Toronto, we've looked at evictions, 10 years of evictions data in Toronto, 240,000 eviction filings. And what we found was that financial firms are filing for evictions at a far higher rate than other types of companies. So that you can see the difference in the behavior. I've also done some research with Chloe St. Hilaire at the University of Waterloo, and we found that financial firms are asking, like the asking rents that they're charging are higher than the average neighborhood rents, especially when you compare it to other types of companies. So yes, they are pushing rents higher than other types of firms. Also, thanks, I saw David Bell put a link to this report on AGIs done by Renovictions TO, also showing that aggressiveness, which Nemoy has referenced, of financial firms in applying for above guideline rent increases. So in terms of behavior, yeah, we are seeing a difference of aggressiveness to pursue profits on behalf of financial firms. We've also seen this, Ricardo, you were asking about other sectors. So we've seen financial firms in seniors housing and students housing, in single family rentals, as Nemoy mentioned. Particularly in Canada, in the seniors housing field, they've been very, very active. 1/3 of all seniors housing in Canada has been acquired by financial firms, 22% of long-term care homes, over 40% of retirement living centers. And researchers in that field are still doing research to see if there is a difference in behavior. But in the United Kingdom, researchers have found that one of the ways financial firms save money in that field is through labor costs. And so if you're cutting healthcare workers and care aides, this just has demonstrable impacts on quality of life outcomes and health outcomes for elderly people. So there's major impacts there. In the United States, researchers have found that private equity firms that buy seniors housing across the country over many years have had a 10% higher rate of mortality in those homes. So there are findings that do show the impacts of financial firms are worse in all types of housing and care settings.
Thank you, Martine. Nemoy, did you want to just jump in?
Yes, I did. I wanted to add that, while I think it's important that we're focused on these particular entities, I think it's also important that we foreground the role of the state, because I think that these particular actors wouldn't behave in the way that they are if there wasn't particular policies that was ensuring their profitability. And I think that's very important for us to not invisibilize the role of the state, because the state created the space for these particular entities to profit and extract value out of vulnerable communities. So I think it's just to highlight is the role of how the state's role has transformed, and from managing social goods to ensuring private profitability. I think it's something that I think we need to stress as well, and not to invisibilize the role of the state in assisting these particular entities to maximize their returns.
That's amazing. Let's go there then. Because I think that's a really cool point. In my day-to-day, sometimes when I try to talk about rental housing and the relationship between landlord and tenants as exploitation, sometimes what I get as a pushback is, but it's legal. And I try sometimes to explain exactly. You just made my point. It's legal. Therefore, it just shows us that this is a structural situation where there are rules in place, there are institutions in place, there's actors in place that have all set the game in a way that what they do, it's legal. And it's sometimes, and then we get into the cultural aspect of it all, it's even commendable. Or when someone takes a second mortgage and puts some tenants in to sort of make some money out of it, it's like, wow, you're so smart. It's such an entrepreneurial spirit of your part, right? So there's the cultural aspects that also supports it. But that's a little bit too far for today. So let's talk about other actors. Let's talk about the state. Let's talk about other economic actors. Let's talk about other institutions, and including the sort of some aspects of civil society that play a role directly or indirectly on this. Leilani, you talked about human rights, and you talked about how that was you decided to go there when you had that platform or that role. And I think that, and you're also talking about the need for a global response. For me, that connects, in my head, that connects to the role of state or potentially even international institutions. Can you take it from there?
Sure. And I'm so glad you raised that, Nemoy. So hugely important, especially where human rights are concerned. So the beauty about human rights is the clarity about accountability. Human rights is just an accountability mechanism, right? So, or framework. So under human rights law, domestic or international, it's really clear who is responsible for whom, who's accountable to whom. States are accountable to people. So if you look at Canada, go back to the mid-1990s when the state really got out of social housing and really let the free market reign. What they did was they pivoted to the free market and they said, go, build, don't build, do whatever you want. The world is your oyster. What they didn't do and didn't say to developers and those in the housing sector is, oh, and by the way, you're engaged in an area that is a human right. And as a result, your business practices are going to have to be human rights compliant. They kind of forgot that second part of the message. And so as a result, what we see, and it was Harper who really allowed REITs to run the way REITs are running, Prime Minister Harper, what we see is not a tax loop or a tax go around for REITs. We actually see preferential tax treatment of REITs. That's worse, in fact, if you see what I mean. It's not like REITs are found some loophole. No, the red carpet was rolled out for them. They are not taxed like corporations. And the only way in which taxation works for REITs is at the unit holder or like the shareholder end. So a shareholder might pay income tax, but where a shareholder is a pension funds don't pay income tax on their investments. And so absolutely states are engaged in the furtherance of the financialization of housing. And it is up to states to rein this in for sure. I mean, they have the capacity to do so through legislation. Clearly, they could, as I think was said at the outset, Martine, queried, should these actors be involved in housing at all? Well, maybe they shouldn't, and that can be dealt with legislatively, right? We are a far ways away from there for sure. Other actors I'd like to mention, and I noticed that a friend and colleague is in the audience here, Manuel from Spain, and he knows about this firsthand and has researched it in detail and has written a report for the Federal Housing Advocate, and he also has worked with me on something. Banks have to be held accountable as well, both national level or regional banks like Bank of Canada setting interest rates so low, making free money at the beginning of the pandemic, right? Interest rates were already low. They made them lower at the beginning of the pandemic. And those of us who study this stuff, we knew right away what was going to happen. It was a runaway train for investment in housing. And so banks like the Bank of Canada should be tying their policies, their fiscal policies to, and monetary policies, I should say, to the human right to housing. But even regular banks should not be lending to any actor who is going to engage in the practices that these actors do, like displacements and forced evictions, period. There's a group out in San Francisco, and I wish I could remember their name. I can't get it off the top of my head, but they've been going to banks and encouraging banks not to lend to they say don't engage in displacement lending. I love this term, displacement lending. So, and they've been quite successful with several banks in that region. So there's a couple of actors thrown at you.
Thank you, Leilani. Alejandra, when you have a market-based system like this, that it's set up so that one group can appropriate income from the other and just keep transforming in more and more wealth, we have some key states, some key players, right? Leilani mentioned a couple. We have the state choosing not to intervention, which is always a very active and deliberate action. You have the bank system that is more directly and more visibly sort of supporting this process. From your perspective, when you're on the ground, when you are fighting an AGI or an eviction, where you're trying to organize, who are, other than landlords, you already talked a little bit about that dynamic, other than landlords, do you have other allies or other institutions or players that you see yourself up against?
Well, I would like to start with the Canadian Mortgage Housing Association, because in first hand, our government says that they plan a national housing strategy, but this is not a real national housing strategy. And we see the Canadian Mortgage Housing Association lending money to the REITs. So in this first place, how you can say you really want to tackle this issue of affordability, but on the other hand, you are lending money to the people who are the ones who do the evictions, the demolitions, all these people. So that needs to be taken into consideration, and we see it all the time when we are working with the members and buildings. Isn't it? This come out and again, well, the banks, we have been asking to the banks as well, well, to the TD Bank, and they had answered to us that they're going to look up at it, but no reply yet. The other thing that we see is that sometimes people don't believe that we can do changes. And this, I think, so is important to mention, because we're in a point that is going to be bad, what I'm going to say, but we're in a point where really people are seeing that this is something that is a reality that is affecting everybody, because this financialization of housing is not only affecting low income and moderate income, it's affecting now middle class, and it's going to affect the society itself with safety. So people sometimes don't believe that getting together, we can do changes. And I think so this is something that needs to be, the government or organizations needs to start to work more in that. We have been working, there are other organizations that have been working, but it should be something that needs to be in the loop for the government. What else I can say to that? No, I think so. Leilani and Nemoy say very well about the other things that I wanted to talk. So it's
Great.
okay. Thank you.
Martine, do you have one or two examples of the role of the state or other institutional actors in making things worse, or at least not doing what they can to stop the bleeding?
Yeah, I mean, I think Alejandra just mentioned a really, really good one, which is the National Housing Strategy Funds, which, we have, our housing agency has a goal to make housing affordable for Canadians and reduce homelessness and all these things. And in fact, are giving cheap money to the very companies who make it their business strategy to make housing less affordable. I can't find anything more contradictory than that, that's working against what we need to happen, which is to make housing more affordable and support the types of organizations that are going to actually do that. Other examples of the state making things worse is in terms of rent control and tenant protections. So as Leilani mentioned, these firms came into this sector, rental housing, when rent control protections were weakened, when we saw rent control deregulated in the 1990s in Ontario and other places. And so these firms saw this golden opportunity to buy up apartment buildings and raise the rents, which were now easier to raise because of vacancy control, decontrol, which many have mentioned. We also have other loopholes like AGIs. And so stronger rent controls and tenant protections would go a long way towards improving this problem, but we're not seeing that kind of thing happening. Instead, we're seeing, Bill 23, who wants to talk about it, but increased deregulation and increased support for developers is actually just going to enrich those people and not provide more affordable housing. So there's lots of ways the state's making things worse, Ricardo. Unfortunately, we don't have all day list them, but there's lots of ways.
Nemoy, you opened this can of worm, not me. So I'm gonna let you clean up this mess and give us some concluding thoughts. My favorite would be if you mention the role of pensions, because for me that's something we have to talk about out loud too.
I think that's a very important point. I think that we should be examining the role of pensions, like Leilani talked about. Pensions have played a big role, and they've played a big role not just within this market, but they've played a big role in the US, in Western Europe, and even South America in places like Brazil. And where, pension funds like the Canadian pension, CPPIB, I always get it, who invest, quite heavily in housing, not just here in Canada, but even across the globe. I think that there should be some policies put in place to ensure that their investment is providing adequate and accessible and affordable housing. And I think one of the through the work that I've been doing, I've come across various companies who are helping to transform Toronto's housing ecosystem. Pension funds like AIMCO or BCIMC, which are the management arms of provincial Crown public pension funds, and who manages these funds. The other point that I want to even stress is that we have to ask, why are they invested in these? And across the globe, pension funds are a lot of pension funds are underfunded. And as a result, they're leaning towards these risky alternative investments, such as real estate, and investment within financial intermediaries, such as asset management and private equity firms, in order to help to close and bridge the gap in terms of the funding that they have to provide to future pensioners. The other point that I want to stress that we don't talk a lot about is even the role of university endowments. University endowments invest heavily as well in these financial intermediaries. And I think that it's important for us to examine, bring their investment into the light as well, and actually create policies to prevent how the way that university endowments invest, because some of their investment, quite frankly, are exacerbating the affordability problems for their own student body and their frontline workers. And so I think it's important for us to create policies that actually curb this sort of investment behavior.
Thank you everyone for this great conversation so far. It's almost time, and I want to wrap up on a kind of actual action-oriented note. So what's next? Where do we go from here? We have a very diverse audience with us, people looking at these issues from different angles, from different walks of life. But I will make the assumption here that folks who are listening to this, they're not happy with the state of affairs. If they're not already part of a social movement, they will be looking for ways to join the resistance, to join a movement, or to be active in any way, shape, or form on this housing issue and a more broader and a broader sort of struggle against the economic system that we have right now. So I will start with Leilani, since she's an internationally known troublemaker in the group, and tell us where do we go from here?
Well, where I'm going, I don't know where we go, and everyone's situated so differently. But so for about a year and a half or so, I toiled away with a group of folks, including Martine, Manuel, Nemoy, I think, weighed in, a whole bunch of people on this webinar, to draft a set of directives, which we call the shift directives from financialized to human rights-based housing. They're really aimed at both investors and governments. And the idea is that they offer a way forward legislatively, as well as in terms of policies. And so there's these. I'll put the link in the chat. And they're really broad, so they cover everything that we could manage to get in 10 directives. But we cover some of the things that Martine was just raising around all the laws and policies that are very weak, don't protect tenants. We offer a vision for what real estate investment trusts and other investors should or shouldn't do in the housing space. We talk about new and emerging forms of financialization, student housing, long-term care, the gamut, and really trying to emphasize the need for strategies, housing strategies that are genuinely rights-based and implemented as such. In Canada, we have a rights-based housing strategy. We have a National Housing Strategy Act that recognizes the right to housing, but there's no implementation as of yet. That doesn't mean it won't happen. In any event, my sense right now is that I need to broaden my own tent, as painful as that is. So I've started to sit with some of these investors. And in fact, I'm doing a webinar next week that's really aimed at investors to try to get them to at least understand that they're operating in a human rights space. And I will continue to hold all governments accountable. And I think that's really that's where the fix will really come.
Martine, where does your fix come from?
Well, a couple places. I think there's all sorts of policy changes to fight for, which kind of follow directly from our discussion of what is the state doing wrong, to be like, change all that. So instead of using National Housing Strategy funds to support financial firms, use those to support the construction and maintenance of truly affordable housing operated by social housing operators, nonprofits, co-ops, community land trusts, all these non-market housing providers that aren't treating housing like a commodity or a financial asset, and that are able to protect people from displacement and to ensure security of tenure. So much more support for that would be great. I agree. I mean, I would also just say read the directives that Leilani has shared, because I have learned a lot from those. And there's a whole spectrum of recommendations there for policy change, ranging from things that seem pretty immediately achievable to some more aspirational goals that I think we can organize around and fight for, including things like asking that big question about, like, why are these companies even allowed to own housing in the first place? In some places we've seen, well, Berlin is the big example where people are saying, well, let's expropriate the housing that's owned by these big companies over a certain number of units. In other places, we've seen other ways to limit the ownership. So, for example, in Australia, you can't own, you get taxed more based on how many properties you own. And so, surprise, surprise, you don't see as much consolidation of ownership there because the state has made that expensive. So I think looking at all sorts of ways to use whatever tools we have to prevent these firms from doing what they do, including, you know, working with banks, working with pension funds, trying to stop this on many different levels. I've already mentioned rent controls and tenant protections. Strengthening those is just central. And if you don't have vacancy decontrol and you don't have these loopholes, it just cuts off the business strategy of these firms. And they can't make money from housing. And I think what we want is these firms to get out of housing because they're in it for what they can take from it, not what they can contribute. And we haven't seen any benefits from having this institutional players in the housing sector. It's only been bad. But I think that the really, like, one of the most direct ways forward is organizing. So there's lots of people here who have more experience than that with me, but people working with your neighbors and your community to fight back against this is effective, and can be effective maybe in the shorter term than waiting for policy changes that could take a while if they do come. So I've been very inspired by the work of many organizers, including Parkdale Organize. There's some people from that organization here who have fought against these landlords and have won, and have protected people from getting evicted, and have prevented rent increases, And it's been very inspiring. And I know these companies are huge and they have lots of lawyers and they have way more money than us. But I think that regular people organizing together collectively are stronger, and this terrifies them. And we've seen huge wins from relatively small numbers of people who are fighting back.
Thank you, Martine. Nemoy, over to you.
You know, I don't know where to start because Martine has said a lot of them, but
Sorry.
I think no, it's all good. I think one of the things I think, you know, I really, you know, go back to the pensioners and the unions. I think one of the things I do encourage is, you know, greater solidarity with tenant unions and labor unions, because of the fact that I encourage that labor unions to look beyond livable wages as their campaign and to expand that campaign into pressuring their pension boards into divesting their interest in some of these financial intermediaries that actually create these affordability problems, and why even the wages that you do receive are not even enough to secure adequately secure housing in the city. You know, so I think that's one of the things that I think we need to encourage is greater solidarity. I think some of the other things that I think, even as Martine has suggested, with respect to better policies around taxation around REITs. Even though I share a similar opinion, though I think that we should also be focusing on asset management firms in the way that they're investing within our housing system. I think that there needs to be antitrust laws that need to be carried out within the housing market itself, because of the fact that the industry is very much ripe for the creation of an oligopolistic rental market, and where you have just a few major players that are delivering or providing housing within the private sector. And currently, right now, financialized landlords in Toronto own approximately 54% of the market share of apartment sales since 1995. And with Starlight itself having approximately 10.5% of those of that market. And they continue to grow, and they continue to acquire some of the portfolios of smaller entities. So I think that we need to be putting in caps. We need to be expropriating properties from these particular entities and returning them back to communities. And I think that we need to engage in a more paradigm shift in where we're not and where capitalist land relations is not governing the adequate distribution of housing.
Thank you, Nemoy. And Alejandra, you have the last word. What do we do next? What do you do next? What are your suggestions? How do we go about this?
Well, yes, in behalf of ACON, I really like the idea of Nemoy to bring the labor. Well, we have been working with the labor. The labor always has been for a progressive and for human rights. But I remember the times, well, I wasn't here in Canada, but I know that when the labor was on it, a lot of co-ops were built. So I think the labor needs to be there in power. But but at ACON has been doing a lot of protests, and we are not only making noise, we really are making change as well. We went to, for example, in Montreal this year in the summer, and we went to the PSP, the public sector fund, and we were there, about 250 people, and we demanded to speak with the CEO and to speak to people, the ones who are the labor, isn't it? The labor movement there. And because The issue is that many people don't know that their pension fund is going to that immoral system, isn't it? And some members of ACOR actually were from this public sector fund pensions. And they were like, what? My money, my sweat is going to that? So I think so this will be a good campaign to start. Well, we have been doing it to tell the people, look at where your money is invested. I don't even want to ask where my money is invested because I am a housing worker. Imagining the money is invested in this will be devastated more than we are already. So this, I think so we're going to continue doing that. The other thing that we want and always say, get involved with organizations, could be the shift, could be with Martine, could be with Nemoy, I don't know, could be with ACOR, but get involved. Because I used to be a complainer, always complain, but I never do since, isn't it? Like, so it's good to be involved. It's good to, well, you cannot be involved, well, give money to the organization. Because money is important, isn't it? Money pays for salaries. Well, I mean, I know how to explain that. Everybody knows that. But what I try to say is get involved somehow. If you don't like to go to the actions, well, get money. But if you like to go to the actions, go to the actions. If you like to go and participate in online actions, go. In ACOR, we had a lot of online actions. You can go to www.acorncanada.org. As well, we are in Facebook, we are in Twitter, we are in Instagram, follow us. And if you want to become a member, you can send us an email and you can become a member. And the other thing that I would like to finish is that the government knows the solution. The government has enough tools. The government is a government that don't want to do the change. So don't be fooled. I don't say that you're fool, okay? I say don't allow that them fool us, telling us that they can. They have the money, they have the power, they have the legislation, they have the brains. It's only about money. This is a monster of money greediness. So I think so. I would like to stop there and thank you so much for the invitation. Huh?
Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you so much. Get involved somehow, anyhow. That's a great point to end on. And I absolutely love and appreciate your point about governments know how to deal with this. And I would say this is against my own self-interest as a researcher. Knowledge is not the missing link. We do not need another framework for how to research for a consultation. There are so many ways we can be acting on this right now. We named a few of these ways right here. You named a few of those ways. I'm sure we're going to talk about more of those in the afternoon. Knowledge is not the missing link. This is not as complicated as it is presented to be. There's a clear issue here, which is power, political and economic power, and that we will address that with action, as you so nicely put it. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I think this has been great. At least I have really enjoyed this. And again, thanks for everyone also who listened in, and for all those people who were just sharing resources and having a great chat. I couldn't pay too much attention to this, but it looks like there was a great chat and sharing in that space too. I will now pass it on to Magda or to Dania.
We'll invite Doug to do the introduction he wasn't able to do at the beginning of the panel.
Thank you, Dania, and thank you to all of our thought leaders for such a rich conversation today. I apologize for the tech problems that I experienced earlier. We were talking about how housing is a human right, a right that is shared among all people across Turtle Island. As we gather here today, we acknowledge that this land has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. The land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, Huron, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. The territory was the subject of the Upper Canada Treaties, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. For today's for today's meeting and upcoming breakout sessions. I am situated in Toronto, which is the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. We are mindful of broken covenants and need to reconcile our history and relations with Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge that the Canadian government did pursue a policy of cultural genocide to divest itself of its legal and financial obligations to Indigenous peoples and gain control over their land and resources. We are mindful of the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action to redress the legacy and impacts on Indigenous families and communities. We acknowledge the call to action to amend the colonial policies of the past, address colonial legacy, and to engage in a process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples of Canada. We acknowledge that we walk upon the territories and original nations of the first peoples of this land, whose children, families, and adults and seniors continue to cry out for justice. Thank you, and I'm going to pass it on to my colleagues to start the breakout session.